Trump versus China and Iran at G20 summit. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. At the end, comment and let us know what you think. Welcome to the Kingdom Report. I'm Yeshua ben Yeshua of the House of David. In the name of Yahweh Elohim, King of the universe, and Yeshua HaMashiach, also known as Jesus the Christ, Shalom. Today, representatives from 19 countries and the European Union gather in Osaka, Japan for the 9th annual G20 summit, an international economic forum consisting of the top 20 economies of the world. Collectively, the G20 accounts for some 90% of gross world product and 80% of world trade. The summit, scheduled for June 28th and 29th, is widely expected to be dominated by the recent sanctions imposed by the U.S. on China in retaliation for its unfair trade practices, along with last week's shooting down of a U.S. drone near the southern coast of Iran. Last May, President Trump raised his original tariffs on $20 billion in imported goods from China from 10% to 25%, increasing pressure on Chinese President Xi Jinping to end predatory policies that give Chinese companies an unfair advantage in such advanced technologies as robotics, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicles. Among its reason for imposing new sanctions, the Trump administration has pointed to Beijing's hacking into the computer systems of American companies to steal trade secrets and unfairly subsidizing Chinese companies, allowing them to remain competitive despite increased U.S. tariffs. America's trade deficit with China, which until recently was a major threat to U.S. dominance in the world market, was brought on by weak negotiating and anti-American policies coming from previous administrations. In response to the Trump sanctions, Beijing has pushed back by taxing $110 billion in U.S. products, focusing on its soybean imports in an attempt to undercut Trump's support in the American Farm Belt. In a countermove, President Trump has provided American farmers with federal subsidies to ease the burden of increased Chinese taxation. In addition, Trump's response to the downing of a U.S. drone in international airspace has confounded his political opponents, who have accused the president of pushing an overly aggressive foreign policy agenda. After initially ordering a military strike, the president rejected the use of force in retaliation for the loss of an unmanned drone, calling his decision unbalanced when he discovered that the planned U.S. attack would kill an estimated 150 Iranians. In addition to his new tariffs on China, on Monday, Trump imposed increased economic sanctions on Iran as well. The new round of sanctions were applied directly to the office of the supreme leader, along with other Iranian officials. Fox News correspondent John Roberts reports on the summit from Osaka, Japan.
It's great to be with you.
President Trump wasted no time getting straight to business at the G20 after touching down, immediately heading to a bilateral dinner meeting with Australia's Conservative Prime Minister Scott Morrison, with trade top of mind.
And I've inherited massive trade deficits with our allies, and we even help our allies militarily.
On the agenda today, bilateral meetings with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Modi of India, German Chancellor Merkel, Brazilian President Bolsonaro, and Vladimir Putin. But tomorrow's meeting with Xi Jinping continues to dominate the conversation. Administration officials today shot down reports that the U.S. may agree to ease restrictions on Chinese telecom giant Huawei as a precondition of that meeting.
There are no preconditions. I don't know where that story came from or what they're talking about. We believe it's quite possible, if the meeting goes well, that the Chinese will come back to the negotiating table.
The administration also denied rumors that President Trump has agreed to postpone for 6 months new tariffs against China, though officials conceded such a deal could emerge during talks.
I would like to once again admonish the U.S. and say that fighting a trade war and adding tariffs will only end up hurting itself and others, which does not help resolve the issue at all.
While there is no official bilateral meeting between the two leaders, French President Emmanuel Macron says he will ask President Trump to ease some sanctions against Iran to bring them to the table. In Paris today, the president's special envoy on Iran insisted U.S. sanctions have been remarkably effective.
American sanctions alone have been stronger than the multilateral sanctions of the past. We need to convey to Iran that there is no acceptable level of lethal assistance to its proxies around the region.
President Trump begins a day of meetings with some disagreements, tweeting his displeasure that India has high tariffs on U.S. goods and raising eyebrows in Japan, saying the defense deal between the U.S. and Japan was so one-sided that if the U.S. got into a conflict, Japan would watch it on a Sony TV.
Overall, obligations on each of Japan and the United States are balanced. It is irrelevant to say it is one-sided.
The friendship between President Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Abe is strong enough that the two will likely quickly get past that comment in their bilateral meeting this morning. But it is another indication that these big multinational confabs, President Trump isn't shy about calling out even close friends if he thinks what's happening is unfair to the United States. Brett?
John Roberts, early Friday morning in Osaka, Japan. John, thank you.
President Trump and President Xi of China are expected to meet on Saturday, with China's dire economic circumstances resulting from the new tariffs, along with the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, widely expected to top the two leaders' agendas. The great concern coming from Trump's globalist critics is that the American people are carrying the brunt of Trump's tariffs. But the fact is that China, being a communist country, subsidizes its government-controlled companies to maintain their viability in the U.S. market, so that the American consumer is completely unaffected by the additional sanctions on Beijing. But most importantly, beyond the Trump administration's goal of free, fair, and reciprocal trade, the stiff new sanctions on China serve another strategic purpose, which has been woefully underreported and largely ignored by mainstream fake news. When President Trump took office in January of 2017, the imminent threat of a nuclear attack coming from the Korean Peninsula was ever present. North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-Un's testing of ballistic missiles with the capability of reaching American soil was of serious concern to the U.S. military and office holders in Washington. And the president's harsh response with his little rocket man rhetoric and threat to obliterate North Korea was seen by mainstream news as clear proof of their portrayal of Trump as being a puppet of Russian President Vladimir Putin and mentally unfit for public office. And on the occasion of his second meeting with Chairman Kim, Trump's decision to walk away without a deal added to the perception of Democrats and rhinos of the president as a reckless negotiator with little grasp of the nuances of foreign policy. But in reality, Trump was engaged in a complex game of chess with China, in which his goal of free and fair trade and denuclearizing North Korea were being simultaneously addressed.
Basically, they wanted the sanctions lifted in their entirety, and we couldn't do that. They were willing to denuke a large portion of the areas that we wanted, but we couldn't give up all of the sanctions for that. So we continue to work, and we'll see, but we had to walk away from that particular suggestion. We had to walk away from that.
Rather than viewing Kim Jong-un as a trigger-happy foreign dictator, the president no doubt recognized from the outset that the reluctance of Chairman Kim was based on the Benghazi debacle that occurred in Libya under the Obama-Biden administration. Despite the mainstream media's portrayal of Kim Jong-Un as an unstable tyrant with a deep hatred for the Western world, clearly the North Korean leader had good reason to distrust a U.S. call for nuclear disarmament. After Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi agreed to denuclearize his nation in 2003, a U.S. military intervention in Libya in 2011, spearheaded by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, led to the assassination of Gaddafi. The brutal murder was later revealed to be a disgraceful U.S. effort to stop Gaddafi's intention to establish a gold-backed currency to compete with the euro and the dollar as an international reserve currency in Africa. Take a look at how Clinton responded to the news of Gaddafi's death at the time.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
Oh, I'm sure it did.
Clinton's reaction to the incident speaks volumes about the true character and hidden agenda of the Obama-Biden administration. Based on its economy being second only to the U.S. and its proximity to the Korean Peninsula, China is indispensable to North Korea's economic survival, and therefore President Xi has tremendous influence with Chairman Kim. And as a result of the brilliant foreign policy coming from the Trump administration, in the days leading up to the summit, the Chinese leader has quietly been applying pressure on the North Korean leader to cooperate with President Trump's call for denuclearization in an effort to persuade Trump to ease U.S. sanctions, which are crippling the Chinese economy.
This is a long overdue trip, as North Korea's leader Kim Jong-Un had invited the Chinese leader in March 2018. And the timing is significant, just before President Xi Jinping is expected to sit down with U.S. President Donald Trump for talks at the G20 summit in Japan next week. Analysts say China too wants to see North Korea denuclearized and not go back to its past Pyongyang policy of promoting parallel development of its nuclear and economy. Hit hard by international sanctions, North Korea will likely use the opportunity to seek economic assistance from China, which had in the past offered aid to North Korea following similar visits. Meanwhile, South Korea remained optimistic that Mr. Xi's trip will help in the denuclearization process. While some have dismissed Mr. Xi's trip to Pyongyang as a largely symbolic affair, for President Xi, this trip could still serve many purposes. His country is embroiled in a bruising trade war with the United States, and reports suggest that he may use the North Korean card to mitigate any fallout should trade talks with President Trump collapse. Lim Yang-seok, CNA, Seoul.
North Korea's economic dependence on China will quite likely persuade Chairman Kim to concede to the U.S. call to destroy his nuclear arsenal rather than see his nation fall even further into economic ruin. In the case of Iran, in 2009, Obama laid out his anti-nuclear war agenda, which focused primarily on preventing Iran from gaining access to nuclear weapons. This agenda was supposedly the basis for negotiating a deal that would effectively end the Iranian nuclear program and guarantee access to U.S. military officials to ensure total compliance. In 2015, President Obama declared that the nuclear agreement his administration had then reached with Iran would meet America's core objectives in eliminating the possibility of nuclear weapons in Iran. Take a look.
Today, the United States, together with our allies and partners, has reached a historic understanding with Iran, which, if fully implemented, will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Today, after many months of tough, principled diplomacy, we have achieved the framework for that deal. And it is a good deal, a deal that meets our core objectives. This framework would cut off every pathway that Iran could take to develop a nuclear weapon. First, Iran will not be able to pursue a bomb using plutonium because it will not develop weapons-grade plutonium. Second, this deal shuts down Iran's path to a bomb using enriched uranium. Iran has agreed that its installed centrifuges will be reduced by 2/3. Third, this deal provides the best possible defense against Iran's ability to pursue a nuclear weapon covertly, that is, in secret. Between now and the end of June, the negotiators will continue to work through the details of how this framework will be fully implemented, and those details matter. Remember, I have always insisted that I will do what is necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and I will. But I also know that a diplomatic solution is the best way to get this done and offers a more comprehensive and lasting solution. It is our best option by far.
This misleading announcement turned out to be yet another empty promise coming from the Obama-Biden administration. In reality, President Trump inherited a nuclear arms agreement in which the Iranians, who remain the chief sponsors of terrorism around the world, were granted new access to global markets through the lifting of international sanctions in exchange for a deal that allowed Iran to continue with its nuclear program, including the enrichment of uranium and, quote, managed access to Iranian facilities, with certain sites remaining completely off limits. The agreement knowingly included billions of dollars Tehran would use to fund its terrorism operations, as well as the release of known anti-American Islamic terrorists from prison. In short, prior to the Obama deal, Iran had the capacity to create a nuclear weapon within 2 to 3 months. Under the terms of the Obama deal, that same process would have taken about a year. President Trump has understandably chosen to move the U.S. away from this disastrous arms deal based upon capitulation and appeasement, and return Tehran to the negotiating table with an America First nuclear policy as its guiding principle. Just as with his strategy in negotiating with China, Trump's approach toward Iran, rather than continuing the Obama administration's globalist-influenced foreign policy agenda, features the use of tough economic sanctions, which either decimate the Iranian economy or drive Tehran to the table to negotiate a deal that doesn't merely postpone, but prohibits outright the Iranian production of nuclear weapons. At the end of the day, President Trump's strategy for China, North Korea, and Iran of tariffs rather than rockets is in fact pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into the U.S. Treasury, while at the same time causing America's economically manipulative adversaries to engage in free and fair trade and surrender their capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction. This political excellence is the direct result of the brilliance and justice coming from a stable genius indeed. Selah. Now, prophetically speaking, these very real points of progressive change coming from the Trump administration are beginning to bring peace around the world and are unfolding right before our eyes. And yet for many of us, these triumphs are being lost in the highly popularized version of end-time events promoted throughout mainstream media, both secular and Christian. Along with a steady stream of this false doctrine coming from mainstream churches, mass media sources like the late great Planet Earth and the book-turned-movie Left Behind have popularized a version of end-time events that essentially paint Hamashiach, or Christ himself, the one whom they claim as their savior, as a false prophet. How so? The dispensational or futurist view of the last days, which is what the mass media promotes, teaches in a nutshell that a great deceiver will emerge in our times, who will bring peace to the Israelite nation only to turn on them and the world. This man, whom they have erroneously dubbed the quote, Antichrist, will enter into a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem and declare himself to be the Almighty God of Israel, in fulfillment of the prophecy recorded in the book of Daniel of the abomination of desolation. But the real truth is, when the disciples of Yeshua, looking upon the temple in Jerusalem standing before them in their day, asked when would his prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple come to pass, Yeshua himself replied by referring to the armies of Rome surrounding the city. He then prophesied, "When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And thus the very Messiah himself defined the abomination of desolation to be the Romans' desecration of the temple in 70 AD. This simple point of truth alone utterly destroys the myth of our day and age being a season of great tribulation for the saints, rather than a season of mass deliverance of the saints, as it is written. The sad fact is that under this false prophetic scenario, the peacemaking of President Trump is seen by many as a potential threat, rather than as victories for the forces of good. But in reality, this is nothing more than a highly promoted and well-orchestrated demonic ruse, emanating from spiritual wickedness in high places, to create fear among the just, in a twisted and futile attempt to steal the ultimate victory over darkness from the children of light. Nevertheless, as it is written, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of Yah." Take heart, you righteous of the earth, and fear not, for indeed the meek, the so-called deplorables and irredeemables, shall in fact inherit the earth. Selah. Hear, O Israel, Jehu is routing Jezebel as the deep state is becoming shallow in its impending doom. He who has ears to hear, let him understand. Toda Rabbah, and thank you for listening. Until our next report, I'm Yeshua ben Yeshua of the House of David, reminding you to stay vigilant and stay blessed. And remember, it's kingdom time. Shalom.
If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and bell icon to receive instant notifications from KYCN Radio so you'll never miss new uploads. Enjoy your day and thanks for watching.